On October 12, 1972, a Fairchild FH-227D aircraft departed from Montevideo, Uruguay, carrying 45 passengers, including members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, their friends, and family. The flight was routine, crossing the vast expanse of the Andes Mountains to reach Santiago, Chile. From the air, the landscape stretched as a patchwork of snow-capped peaks, jagged ridges, and frozen valleys. The mountains rose sharply, with some peaks exceeding 20,000 feet. The air was thin, cold, and clear, revealing distant glaciers and rocky outcrops. The Andes themselves form a natural barrier separating the east and west of South America. From above, the terrain appeared inhospitable. Valleys were narrow, often shadowed by steep cliffs. Snowfields reflected the sunlight, while hidden crevices and ice sheets hinted at treacherous surfaces. The environment was silent, apart from the occasional gust of wind passing through the ridges. In this altitude, human presence was scarce. Villages were few and far between, and no roads or settlements were visible from the air. At this stage, there was no immediate danger. The aircraft maintained its course at cruising altitude. Passengers moved about the cabin quietly, some gazing out the windows at the unfolding scenery. Flight attendants attended to routine checks, and the pilots monitored instruments against the backdrop of the imposing mountain range. The isolation of the Andes was evident even from the air. The mountains demanded respect, their scale dwarfing the human presence. The combination of height, remoteness, and severe weather meant that any problem would be difficult to address. At this moment, the landscape was calm, indifferent, and expansive. No one yet anticipated that within hours, this environment would become a site of profound survival, where every decision would determine life or death. The passengers aboard the flight were primarily members of the Old Christians Club, a rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay. The team consisted of young men, mostly in their late teens and early 20s, known for their athleticism, discipline, and camaraderie. Many had been playing rugby since childhood, training together in local clubs and schools. Alongside the team were friends, family members, and acquaintances, traveling to Chile to attend a scheduled match. Among them were a few older adults, parents and relatives accompanying the younger passengers. Most came from urban backgrounds in Montevideo, familiar with city life but with limited experience in high-altitude wilderness or extreme weather conditions. While some had basic knowledge of first aid or outdoor activity, none had prepared extensively for survival in snowbound mountains. Their primary skills related to teamwork, physical endurance, and resilience, qualities cultivated on the rugby field rather than in remote landscapes. The team had been traveling regularly for matches, tours, and competitions. Their journey was routine in planning, aimed at sports participation and the social connections associated with rugby. For many, the trip represented excitement, opportunity, and the chance to compete internationally. The group's cohesion was strong, friendships formed the basis of cooperation and mutual support. This cohesion would later influence decisions made under duress. The pilots and crew were experienced in regional flights. They were trained for standard safety procedures, instrument navigation, and routine meteorological challenges. The aircraft itself was a Fairchild FH-227D, a twin-engine turboprop designed for short to medium regional routes. Maintenance records indicated the plane was serviceable, though flying over the Andes always involved inherent risks due to rapidly changing weather, high altitudes, and limited options for emergency landings. At the outset, all passengers and crew understood the flight as a brief, scheduled journey. Their expectations were shaped by familiarity and confidence in aviation procedures, combined with trust in the pilots and the aircraft. The landscape below, imposing but distant, was observed more as scenery than as a potential threat. In retrospect, the group's background, a mixture of physical fitness, strong social bonds, and unpreparedness for high-altitude survival, would define the trajectory of their ordeal. Their collective experience would become the foundation for decision-making, cooperation, and endurance once the environment shifted from distant observation to immediate reality. On the morning of October 13, 1972, the flight approached the central Andes under challenging conditions. The mountains were cloaked in dense cloud cover, reducing visibility. Pilots relied on instruments to maintain altitude and navigate through narrow passes. Reports indicate that the crew misjudged their position, believing they had passed the mountain range when, in fact, they remained within it. As the aircraft descended into a valley, the first contact with the terrain occurred. The plane struck a ridge at approximately 13,000 feet. The impact tore sections of the fuselage apart, scattering debris over the ice and rock. Passengers were thrown against seats and bulkheads. Injuries ranged from cuts and bruises to broken bones. The rear section of the plane came to rest on a slope, partially lodged against a snowbank. Immediately following the crash, the survivors assessed their situation. Several were trapped in the wreckage, requiring assistance to free themselves. Others wandered across the ice and snow to gather what supplies remained intact. Food and water were minimal, and medical equipment was limited to basic first aid kits. The pilots and crew sustained serious injuries, some were unable to assist in movement or organization. At that moment, the isolation of the Andes became undeniable. There were no nearby settlements, no signs of passing traffic, and no way to summon immediate help. The nearest inhabited areas were hundreds of miles away, separated by mountains and glaciers. Communication equipment had been damaged in the impact. The survivors recognized that rescue would not be immediate and that they were dependent on their own resources and decisions. The weather added to the challenge. Snowfall and subzero temperatures threatened hypothermia, while high winds increased the risk of injury from exposed terrain. The terrain itself, steep ridges, unstable ice, and hidden crevasses, prevented easy movement and restricted access to parts of the wreckage. In the hours following the crash, the first tasks emerged, tending to injuries, assessing supplies, and establishing shelter among the remains of the fuselage. The initial shock gave way to practical action. The group began to understand the scale of their predicament. They were trapped in one of the most remote and unforgiving mountain ranges in the world, with no guarantee of external assistance. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, the survivors faced the necessity of creating a stable environment within the wreckage. The fuselage offered partial protection from the wind and snow, though gaps in the metal and torn sections allowed cold air to enter. Using seat cushions, luggage, and clothing, the group constructed windbreaks and improvised bedding to retain body heat. The shelter was confined, often forcing multiple individuals to share space to conserve warmth. Water was a constant concern. Snow covered the surrounding slopes, and small ice formations could be melted when feasible. Survivors used metal containers from the wreck to collect snow, heating it over improvised fires or warmed engines, when possible. While the method was slow, it provided a crucial source of hydration in an environment where dehydration could occur quickly at high altitude. Food supplies were minimal. The aircraft's limited provisions included chocolate, wine, and small quantities of dried foods. Rationing became an immediate priority. The group established daily allowances, distributing what little remained evenly to prevent rapid depletion. Each meal, though insufficient for caloric needs, was carefully managed to sustain energy over the initial days. The survivors organized themselves with practical routines. Some members maintained watch, observing weather conditions and surveying nearby slopes. Others were responsible for snow collection and shelter reinforcement. Tasks were divided according to physical ability and injury, with the strongest handling physically demanding work and those with medical knowledge attending to the wounded. Temperature regulation was constant. The Andes at this elevation dropped well below freezing, particularly at night. Clothing was layered and supplemented by any available fabric from luggage or seat cushions. Periodic shifts within the shelter allowed individuals to prevent frostbite or hypothermia. Even minor injuries required careful attention, as infection or exposure could become life-threatening. The group recognized early that the aircraft remained their primary resource. Metal panels could be dismantled for firewood or improvised tools, though care was taken to maintain structural shelter. Blankets and clothing from the wreck were distributed to maximize insulation. Decisions were made collectively, often by the more experienced or physically capable survivors, balancing efficiency with fairness. Despite the calm and practical tone of daily routines, the underlying reality remained: the environment was indifferent, and the Andes offered no assistance. Survival depended entirely on discipline, cooperation, and resource management. Meals were sparse, sleep was interrupted by cold or discomfort, and each day required careful calculation of effort versus need. In these first weeks, the survivors' actions established patterns that would govern the remainder of their ordeal. Shelter, water, and rationed food became central to daily existence. The methods were unremarkable in appearance: melting snow, distributing chocolate, but they represented deliberate adaptation to circumstances that were both immediate and unforgiving. The aircraft wreckage, once a site of trauma, became a locus of routine, providing minimal security in an environment that offered none. As days passed, the survivors confronted the full effects of high-altitude life in the Andes. Temperatures remained below freezing for most of the day, with nights plunging further. Winds swept through exposed ridges, carrying snow and ice into the aircraft wreckage. Hypothermia was an ongoing threat, and frostbite affected several individuals despite careful layering of clothing and shared body heat. The physical environment required constant attention. Snow accumulation around the fuselage needed to be cleared to maintain access and prevent structural collapse. Icicles forming on metal surfaces posed hazards for movement. The slopes below the crash site were steep and unstable, with hidden crevasses. Walking beyond the immediate area became dangerous, and the group largely confined activities to the shelter and nearby snowfields. Water management remained critical. Snow was collected in small amounts daily, melted in metal containers, and carefully rationed. Using too much at once risked waste, too little caused dehydration. The survivors developed systematic methods, assigning individuals to regular collection and heating duties. Fuel for melting snow was limited, so efficiency became essential. The group also organized themselves around roles and responsibilities. Each survivor contributed according to ability. Some monitored injuries and managed first aid care. Others reinforced the shelter, repaired torn fabric, or retrieved supplies from less accessible sections of the wreckage. Decisions were pragmatic and based on necessity, with discussion and consensus guiding actions when possible. Leadership rotated informally, generally aligning with experience and physical capacity. Food scarcity gradually imposed psychological as well as physical challenges. Initial rations of chocolate, wine, and small food stores were insufficient for energy needs. Survivors adjusted by conserving movement, prioritizing essential tasks, and minimizing caloric expenditure. Discipline and planning became integral to daily life, helping manage anxiety and maintain order. Exposure to the elements also required constant vigilance. Clothing and bedding became damp from snow or perspiration, necessitating rotation and drying when conditions allowed. Injuries and frostbite were treated with improvised methods, while illness or fatigue prompted adjustments in task assignments. Even minor missteps could lead to worsening conditions. Mental endurance was as crucial as physical adaptation. Isolation was pronounced. The nearest human settlement was hundreds of miles away, beyond peaks and glaciers. The group maintained routines, conversations, and observation of the environment to sustain focus. While there was no immediate danger, the sense of remoteness created a persistent awareness that survival depended entirely on their actions. Over weeks, these adaptations became habitual. The aircraft wreckage transformed into a base for shelter, water collection, and rationing. Survivors developed strategies for movement, care, and efficiency, refining techniques for melting snow, distributing food, and maintaining warmth. These routines allowed the group to persist in a setting that, at first, seemed unmanageable, demonstrating methodical resilience in one of the world's most unforgiving mountain ranges. As weeks progressed, the survivors faced the limits of available resources. Food supplies from the aircraft had been exhausted, and the environment offered little in terms of edible options. Vegetation was nearly non-existent at this altitude, and local wildlife was scarce. The cold and altitude further reduced physical capacity, making strenuous activity more taxing. The group confronted a critical decision: survival depended on using all available means to sustain life. Historical accounts document that the survivors resorted to consuming the bodies of those who had died in the crash and its aftermath. This measure, undertaken with careful deliberation, was documented as necessary to prevent starvation. The process was organized, portions were rationed, and only what was required for sustenance was taken. Hygiene and storage were managed as best as possible given conditions, recognizing the risk of spoilage in fluctuating temperatures. Physical adaptation continued. The body's metabolism slowed under limited caloric intake, prompting survivors to reduce activity and conserve energy. Tasks were divided to balance exertion with necessity. Injuries and frostbite persisted, requiring attention from those with medical knowledge. Cleaning wounds, keeping bandages dry, and stabilizing fractures became essential to prevent further deterioration. Water remained a daily requirement. Melting snow continued, but the cold slowed the process and limited availability. Survivors prioritized drinking over other uses, understanding that dehydration could quickly exacerbate the effects of starvation and cold. Fire and heat sources were used sparingly, largely to conserve energy and prevent exposure during collection of snow or reinforcement of shelter. Psychological endurance was paramount. Days blurred into one another, and the monotony of routine contrasted with the unpredictability of weather and condition of the injured. The group relied on structure and shared responsibilities to maintain focus, emphasizing cooperation over individual effort. Leadership decisions were practical and occasionally rotated based on ability, ensuring that critical survival tasks were completed efficiently. The environment remained indifferent. Avalanches, sudden wind gusts, and shifting ice added constant risk. Each movement outside the shelter was calculated, avoiding unnecessary exposure. The survivors' bodies adapted to reduced activity, and the mental strain of isolation and starvation became a constant companion. These extreme measures, while difficult to recount, were necessary for life. They reflect the interaction between human endurance and environmental constraint. The group's survival depended on disciplined adaptation, acceptance of harsh realities, and methodical application of limited resources. Their continued existence over the following weeks demonstrated a balance of physical endurance, mental resilience, and pragmatic decision-making in the face of extraordinary circumstances. As the ordeal extended into weeks, the effects of cold, altitude, and malnutrition began to accumulate. Injuries sustained in the crash, initially manageable, worsened under constant exposure and limited treatment. Broken bones healed slowly or not at all, and lacerations risked infection. Frostbite affected fingers, toes, and extremities, causing tissue damage and chronic pain. Illness appeared gradually. Symptoms of altitude sickness, respiratory strain, and weakened immunity became evident. Survivors experienced fatigue, dizziness, and impaired coordination. Simple tasks such as collecting snow or maintaining the shelter required more effort and careful pacing. Minor injuries were magnified by the body's declining resilience. Deaths occurred silently and methodically. Those whose injuries or conditions made survival impossible were attended to with care, and their passing was acknowledged by the group. The necessity of rationing their remains, as described in historical accounts, was approached as a practical matter rather than a choice. Emotional responses existed but were tempered by the focus on sustaining the living. Attempts at early rescue were unsuccessful. Initial hope that passing aircraft or search parties might arrive gradually diminished. The remoteness of the Andes, combined with snow and weather, prevented immediate detection. The survivors adjusted to the realization that outside assistance was not forthcoming and that self-reliance would define the remainder of their ordeal. Time became an abstract measure. Days, weeks, and even hours blended as routine and survival tasks consumed energy. The psychological weight of isolation increased. Decisions about rationing, movement, and shelter had direct consequences on survival, and mistakes could no longer be easily corrected. The group adapted to this pressure through collective action, disciplined routine, and mutual accountability. Physical decline was evident. Weight loss progressed steadily, and energy reserves diminished. Survivors moved deliberately, conserving strength. Even minor slips could result in falls or exposure to wind and snow. The combination of injury, malnutrition, and fatigue created a persistent threat to life. Despite the ongoing deaths and illness, the survivors maintained minimal structure. Shared responsibilities, daily routines, and attention to shelter and hydration continued to define each day. Their actions reflected an understanding that survival depended on order, careful management of resources, and acceptance of the environment's harsh realities. The Andes, indifferent and imposing, remained unchanged. Snow continued to accumulate, winds shifted unpredictably, and daylight periods remained brief at this elevation. Within this context of illness, injury, and mortality, the group persisted, navigating the tension between physical decline and the determination to endure. By late December, after more than 2 months in isolation, the survivors recognized that remaining at the crash site would not guarantee rescue. Supplies were nearly depleted, and the environment continued to impose life-threatening conditions. A decision was made to send a small, physically capable group across the mountains to seek help. The trek would require navigating steep slopes, glaciers, and snowfields with minimal equipment and no established path. The selection of individuals for the journey was pragmatic. Those chosen were relatively uninjured, able to endure extreme cold and exertion, and capable of managing the mental and physical challenges of travel in such a hostile environment. Preparations were minimal, consisting of what clothing, food, and water could be carried. The group departed quietly, leaving behind the remainder to maintain the shelter and await relief. Movement across the Andes was slow and deliberate. The team traversed ridges, avoided crevasses, and monitored snow stability to prevent falls or avalanches. Altitude remained a constant challenge, breath was labored, and the cold further restricted physical performance. Navigation relied on visual cues and rudimentary maps salvaged from the wreckage, with no instruments to confirm position. Over several days, the trekkers faced exhaustion, frostbite, and altitude-related illness. Progress was measured in miles rather than hours, with each slope demanding caution. Rest periods were brief and functional, designed to maintain stamina rather than comfort. Food was limited to small rations carried from the crash site, supplemented where possible by snow for hydration. Eventually, the group reached lower elevations where signs of human habitation appeared, farms, roads, and grazing fields. They encountered residents who, upon hearing the account of the crash, alerted authorities. From this point, rescue operations were coordinated. Helicopters and ground teams navigated the terrain, locating the remaining survivors at the wreckage site. The return of aid was methodical. Injured individuals were evacuated first, followed by others who had endured weeks of starvation and exposure. Medical care was administered immediately upon arrival at nearby facilities. The process was calm and organized, prioritizing stabilization and transportation rather than celebration or spectacle. The trek itself exemplified both physical endurance and calculated decision-making. The survivors' knowledge of the terrain, their disciplined preparation, and the cooperation among the group allowed them to navigate hundreds of miles under extreme conditions. Their journey bridged the gap between isolation and connection with the outside world, ultimately facilitating the survival of those who remained at the crash site. The rescue concluded the immediate ordeal of the Andes survivors, though the effects of 72 days in isolation persisted. Those who endured faced significant physical recovery, malnutrition required careful medical attention, frostbite and injuries demanded ongoing care, and weakened immune systems necessitated rest and rehabilitation. Psychological recovery was gradual, as the memory of extreme isolation, death, and difficult decisions remained present. For the families and the broader public, the event became a documented example of human endurance. Historical accounts emphasized the methodical survival strategies, the disciplined rationing of resources, and the cooperation among the group as critical factors in sustaining life. The Andes disaster was recorded with attention to factual accuracy, highlighting environmental challenges and the interplay between physical limits and pragmatic decision-making. The survivors returned to daily life with quiet recognition of their experience. Their actions were measured and deliberate rather than heroic in narrative tone. Each day in the mountains had required patience, focus, and adherence to basic principles of shelter, hydration, and nutrition. These principles, applied consistently over weeks, ultimately ensured survival. Over time, the story has been examined in historical, medical, and sociological contexts. It illustrates the extremes of human endurance, the effects of prolonged isolation, and the capacity to make critical decisions under pressure. While the event involved tragedy, the documented account provides insight into resilience and adaptation without embellishment. The Andes, silent and unchanged, remain a testament to the environment's indifference. The mountains retain their scale and remoteness, indifferent to human presence or absence. The survivors' experience is framed not as drama, but as a measured record of endurance, a quiet testament to the limits and capabilities of human life in extreme conditions.